In one world, cities were rubble, and bread was a memory. A generation had been raised on rationing, propaganda, and the bitter taste of war. In another world, there was bacon, scrambled eggs, and something called biscuits and gravy. For the German female auxiliaries brought to American POW camps, these two worlds collided on a single plate. They were prepared for interrogation, for punishment, for hatred. They were not prepared for a breakfast so abundant, it felt like a psychological weapon. How do you hate an enemy who feeds you better than your own country ever did? By 1945, the German war machine was not just an army, it was a sprawling bureaucracy, and women were essential to its function. They were the blitzmetal, the lightning girls who operated switchboards and teletypes, the nurses in field hospitals patching up a broken army, the clerks who tracked the dwindling supplies of a dying Reich. They had seen the war from its administrative heart, witnessing the slow, agonizing collapse from the inside. When captured by the advancing Allies in North Africa and Europe, their minds were a fortress built to fear an official doctrine. For years, they had been told that capture by the Americans meant unspeakable horrors. The journey across the Atlantic was therefore not just a transfer of prisoners, but a descent into the imagined abyss. Crowded into the hulls of transport ships, each creak of the vessel, each unfamiliar command shouted by a guard, reinforced their deepest anxieties. They were sailing toward the land of the enemy, a nation portrayed as a crude, brutal caricature, and they expected no mercy. The first crack in that fortress of fear appeared not with a bang, but with a whisper of green. As their prison trains moved inland from the coast, the view from the barred windows was the first true assault on their world view. They saw not the cratered landscapes and skeletal cities of home, but rolling hills, tidy farms, and towns bustling with life. They saw civilians who were not gaunt and gray with hunger, but well-fed and vibrant. It was a nation completely untouched by the devastation they had accepted as the normal state of the world. This America was not the one from their newsreels. This was a land of impossible, almost offensive, peace and prosperity. The POW camps themselves were a paradox. The architecture of captivity was universal. The watchtowers, the barbed wire, the stark wooden barracks. It was all designed to remind them of their status as prisoners. Yet the human element was jarringly different. The American guards were professional, often detached, a far cry from the monstrous figures of propaganda. There was a routine, an order, but it was an order devoid of the ideological cruelty they had been trained to expect. This quiet, dispassionate efficiency was more unnerving than open hostility. It was a silent refutation of everything they believed about their captors. But the ultimate confrontation, the battle that would truly dismantle their preconceptions, was waged not with weapons, but with cutlery. It happened in the mess hall. Marched in for their first morning meal, the women were a study in silent defiance and apprehension. They expected the watery soup and stale slice of rye bread that had become the staple of their existence. Instead, they were met with an aroma of cooking so rich and complex it was almost painful to their deprived senses. Before them, on steaming trays, was a feast beyond comprehension. Mountains of golden, fluffy, scrambled eggs, heaps of crispy, glistening bacon. And at the center of it all, a dish that defied any known culinary category. It consisted of large, warm, bread-like scones, split open and smothered in a thick, creamy white sauce, studded with savory chunks of sausage. They were told this was biscuits and gravy. The words meant nothing. In German, a biscuit was a hard, sweet cookie served with coffee. This soft, savory creation was an alien concept. The gravy was equally baffling. German sauces were typically dark, rich, and built on roux or pan drippings from a roast. This pale, milk-based concoction looked bizarre, suspect. They stared at their plates, a mixture of hunger and deep-seated suspicion warring within them. Was this a trick? Was it some kind of American peasant food, deliberately strange and unappetizing? A silent standoff began. A tense tableau of hundreds of hungry prisoners, a bizarre breakfast, and the quiet, watchful eyes of their American guards. For what felt like an eternity, an entire mess hall held its breath. Then a single spoon scraped against a plate. One woman, driven by a hunger that finally overcame her suspicion, lifted a small portion to her lips. She paused, her expression unreadable. Her comrades watched her, their own forks frozen in midair. A flicker of confusion crossed her face, then surprise, and then, finally, a slow, undeniable wave of relief. She took another, larger bite. That single, simple act broke the spell. 100 other spoons and forks followed suit. The initial silence was replaced by a low murmur, the quiet sounds of eating, and then, tentatively, whispered comments. The taste was a revelation. The biscuit was not a dry cracker, but a warm, fluffy, cloud-like creation that soaked up the gravy perfectly. The gravy itself, so alien in appearance, was rich, savory, and wonderfully seasoned with pepper and herbs. It was a dish designed not for mere sustenance, but for comfort. It was hearty. It was satisfying. It was, to their starved and war-weary palates, impossibly delicious. The scrambled eggs were real. The bacon was plentiful. This was not prison fare. This was a breakfast. In that moment, the entire ideological foundation of their wartime experience began to crumble. This meal was more powerful than any leaflet drop or propaganda broadcast because it was real. It was tangible proof that the world they had been told about was a lie. An enemy who starves you is an enemy you can understand and hate, but an enemy who serves you a breakfast better than any you can remember from the peacetime. That is a complex and deeply unsettling proposition. The biscuits and gravy became an unlikely symbol, a culinary ceasefire in the war of ideologies. Each morning, as they ate, the barbed wire outside seemed a little less menacing. The guards became not just captors, but the facilitators of this strange, new, and comforting routine. This simple act of providing good, wholesome food was a weapon of simple, undeniable plenty. It didn't just fill their stomachs, it began to deconstruct their identity as soldiers of the Reich. They had been taught to see the world in black and white, as a brutal struggle for survival where compassion was weakness. But here, in a POW camp thousands of miles from the front lines, they were being confronted with a quiet, persistent act of humanity that defied all their training. It forced a profound and personal reassessment. If their leaders had been so wrong about the character of the American people, what else had they been wrong about? The war had been a grand, abstract cataclysm of nations and armies. But for these women, the end of their war wasn't marked by a treaty or a general surrender. It was marked by the startling, life-altering discovery of biscuits and gravy, a meal that taught them that even in the midst of unparalleled conflict, the most powerful weapon of all can sometimes be a simple act of kindness served on a plate.